first video lecture for Texas government, and the chapter we're covering this week is the governor and the executive branch of Texas. So, in this chapter, we're going to talk about the governor, the role, responsibility, all that kind of stuff. And then next week, we have a chapter over the rest of the executive branch and kind of the bureaucracy of the executive branch. So, talking about the governor. What are the rules established in the Constitution for being governor in the state of Texas? Eligibility criteria states that you must be at least 30 years of age, a citizen of the United States, now that can be natural born or naturalized, and have lived in the state of Texas for at least 5 years preceding that person's election. The governor cannot hold any other office while governor or accept any salary, reward, or compensation for any service performed while governor. So, this is supposed to prevent corruption and make sure that the governor is focused on the responsibility of being governor of the state of Texas. Now, those are what we call our formal qualifications, but a lot of times things like informal qualifications can be more important to getting the job. These are things like race, gender, what profession a governor comes from, political experience, social connections, and charm and charisma. Here in the state of Texas, almost all of our governors have been, all of them have been white. Most have been Protestant men, with a few, we've had two women governors. And Governor Abbott is our first non Protestant because he is a practicing Catholic. When we wrote the Constitution in 1876, the governor's term was limited to 2 years, but we amended that in 1972 for the governor to have a 4 year term so that he wasn't having to run for re-election as often. But there are no term limits, so someone can run for governor as many times as they want to, and as long as they can keep getting elected, they can continue serving as governor. The longer a governor stays in office, the more power they can amass because they get to appoint people to boards and committees that oversee the different agencies that carry out the work of government. And so the longer they're in office, the more people they will be able to appoint. In a single term, they'll end up overseeing two legislative sessions. So we know our legislature meets every other year in odd numbered years for 140 days. So in a single term of the governor, there will be two legislative sessions. Rick Perry was the longest serving governor so far of the state of Texas. He served 14 years because he also served as kind of served in place of George W. Bush while he was running for president, and then was elected governor once George W. Bush became president. He has been our longest serving and probably most popular governor in the history of Texas. The governor makes a real salary, unlike our legislature. The governor makes $150,000 a year, in addition to a spending account, having a governor's residence in Austin, and a security detail. These are all things that are pretty, expected for, a position as important as the governor. For Texas, we've only had two female governors, Miriam Ma Ferguson, who we'll talk about. She's a bit controversial. And then Ann Richards, who was the last Democrat to serve as governor of the state of Texas before George W. Bush. Like I said, only one has been non-Protestant. Greg Abbott is a practicing Catholic. And all of our governors so far have been white individuals. With the exception of Ann Richards and Rick Perry, all of our governors have come from very wealthy, well-connected families. Rick Perry is actually from a very middle-class background, worked his way up, through the process of government to become governor. Same for Ann Richards. So they're the only two that have more kind of a middle-class upbringing coming into the office. Succession in the state of Texas and almost every other state except 5, there's a lieutenant governor who will take the place of the governor if the governor is impeached, if the governor is killed or passes away while they're in office. that is the way that works. The lieutenant governor will ascend, and then we will elect a new lieutenant governor. And these two individuals are elected separately in our state. So, unlike, say, the president and the vice president, they campaign separately and don't necessarily have to be from the same party or share the same agenda. The governor does benefit when they have a good working relationship with the lieutenant governor, but that's not always the case. We'll talk about that a little bit in this chapter and the next one. Acting governor. Anytime the governor leaves the state of Texas, the lieutenant governor will act as governor in their place until they return. And Rick Perry holds the record also for the longest time as acting governor. He was in charge of the state of Texas for about 2 years while George W. Bush was campaigning to become president. And then we'll talk about how the governor is not the most powerful position in Texas politics, but it is a very high profile position, and many of our governors use it as a stepping stone to a much bigger office. Many of our governors have moved on to the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, and then, of course, President as well, President George W. Bush. Removal from office happens through a similar impeachment process to the president. It's a two-step process where if a governor is accused of corruption, wrongdoing, breaking the law, the House of Representatives will bring articles of impeachment, stating why this individual should be removed from office. If the House votes for impeachment, it then goes to the Senate, and the Senate will vote for conviction. If these are crimes that have been committed, then the governor can be convicted and criminally punished for abusing the power of their office. Our Constitution doesn't lay out specific criteria for impeachment, but we tend to think of it as criminal activity and corruption. Texas has only impeached one governor, James E. Pa Ferguson, husband of Miriam A. Ma Ferguson. James Ferguson, was accused of abusing his power, embezzling funds from government, misapplying public funds, doing favors for his supporters and cronies, and not enforcing the law because he had a lot of cronies in banking and finance and things like that. But it wasn't those things that actually brought about his impeachment. What brought about his impeachment was he pissed off the University of Texas. James Ferguson abused his power in such a way that he would try and have other elected officials and people fired or removed from their positions, all the way down to local government. He was just had a massive ego and abused his power, and he started a fight with UT. And what he did was he wanted to have professors fired from the university who were critical of what he was doing as governor. UT's Board of Regents, filed complaints against him with the legislature and basically pushed for his impeachment because of this intense level of corruption. So he's the first to ever be impeached. If you ever happen to go to the Capitol down in Austin, ask that person who's doing the tour about James Ferguson. When you go into the rotunda, they have all of the pictures of the governors kind of ascending, as you go up. And if you ask them about James Ferguson, they'll usually tell you, we don't like to talk about him. But then Texans, a few years later, elect his wife, Miriam Ferguson, as governor. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. She wasn't impeached, but she was also heavily criticized and accused of corruption as well. Some states have the option of a recall election where they can actually put it to the voters. We don't use that in the state of Texas. We use the impeachment process. Now, the rest of the executive branch is what we call the plural executive, meaning that the executive branch in Texas, the powers are divided up among a bunch of different positions. We have the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, comptroller, that have different responsibilities. So here in Texas, we like small government. We don't vest too much power into one person. We split that power up among different people. And then next week, we'll talk about those other positions that have power in the executive branch. The governor, though, and the executive branch is charged with faithful execution of the law. And this is one of the things that James Ferguson didn't do. But the law is supposed to be enforced through our different government agencies. The governor is the chief executive and oversees those agencies, and it is tasked with the responsibility of making sure those laws are carried out properly and in accordance with the Constitution. The Constitution, the 1876 one that is our current Constitution, it's kind of vague about what that's supposed to mean. And so governors can use executive orders and things like that to expand their power when necessary. The executive order it kind of limits the governor to telling the different agencies how they should carry out their job responsibilities. Um, Here in Texas, the executive order is not as powerful as it is, say, for the president. Um, the president, the executive orders of the president carry the weight of law. For the governor, he can really only tell government agencies how to carry out their duties. Um, so he can use executive orders to, say, declare emergencies, kind of like right now. Governor Abbott has the power to declare an emergency, to order us to quarantine, stay in place, all that kind of stuff. Some people feel that he hasn't gone far enough just yet. Some people want him to go further. Essentially, what he has done is used his executive power to delegate that responsibility to cities and towns and counties. And then they can use this power to fill vacancies in government and things like that. If there's a position that is empty and needs to be filled, they can do that as well. An example of, say, a controversial executive order. Back in 2007, there was an executive order issued by Governor Perry ordering that all Texas girls ages 11 and 12 be required to get the new HPV vaccine that came onto the market. And his reasoning behind this is that, HPV can lead to cervical cancer and things like that. And he believed if we had all girls get this vaccine at an early age, that we could eradicate that in the future. But of course, we have our anti vaxxers who are against vaccines of any kind. We had women's rights advocates saying, why were only girls being ordered to do this? So this ended up becoming a very controversial thing for Governor Perry, despite that he kind of had this positive motivation behind it. And so the executive orders can be recalled or overruled by our court system as well if they are believed to be unconstitutional. In this case, the legislature ended up passing, a bill to overturn this order from Governor Perry. Proclamations are a little different. The governor can use a proclamation to declare a state of emergency, ask for relief funds from the federal government, or they can use it to, say, declare holidays or things like that. A couple of examples. In 2011, there were a bunch of wildfires out in West Texas, and Governor Perry used a proclamation to designate 3 days of official days of prayer for rain. Now, depending on your religious beliefs, that may seem kind of silly. Maybe you should have used the proclamation to ask for assistance or something like that. But sometimes they're just kind of ceremonial in nature. Another example, in 2015, Governor Abbott declared February 2nd, Chris Kyle Day. If you don't know who that is, he was a veteran of the current war. He's apparently the most decorated sniper, has killed the most people as a sniper in military history. And once he came home, he was doing work with veterans that were suffering from PTSD, and one of those individuals murdered him. And so, as a way to kind of honor him and recognize him, Governor Abbott declared a holiday. Now he can't force us to celebrate that day or something like that. It's more of just a way to honor people from the state of Texas who have done or achieved, really important things. Appointment powers. This is where the governor gets to express most of their power. The governor can appoint up to about 3,000 different positions between different executive boards, agencies, commissions, and in a single term, they'll appoint about a third of these. So the longer a governor is in office, the more of these positions they will appoint. These positions still have to be approved by the Senate, and that's just to make sure the governor is appointing qualified people and things like that. But most of the time, especially if the governor is of the same party as the majority, they're going to approve these appointments. Um, the biggest complaint about these appointments is that you know these people may be loyal to the governor more so than the citizens, or pushing the governor's agenda that may be at odds with what citizens want. But the counter argument to that is that the citizens elected the governor, and so they must have, approved of his agenda and elected him for a reason. This is Ann Richards, our second female governor of the state of Texas. And if you don't know much about Ann Richards, she was a very sassy lady, very outspoken, very Texan. She was a Democrat. She's the last Democrat to serve as governor of our state. Very cool lady. I got to meet her back when I was an undergrad. But she actually did something very controversial for her day, and people believe it may have contributed to her not winning re-election. When she was elected governor, she said that she wanted to make the government of Texas look like the people of Texas. And what she meant was that she was going to use her power to appoint women and people of color to positions in government that reflected the diversity of the state. And so during her time as governor, 48% of her first 650 appointments were women, 12% were African American, and 25% were Latino. And, this is at a time when Texas is still firmly controlled by conservatives. And so this made a lot of people very unhappy because she was shaking up the status quo of how Texas had been for a very long time. And a lot of people think this may be why she ended up losing to George W. Bush. I believe it was in 1992. Legislative powers. So the governor doesn't have a ton of legislative powers as far as forcing the Congress to do what the governor wants. The governor does benefit from being of the same party or having a good working relationship with the Congress. The governor can make recommendations, lobby for their own agenda, but the legislature is free to take that up or ignore that if they want to. They're under no obligation to do what the governor wants. Now, during a legislative session, there is a rule that no bills should be passed in the first 60 days. And the reason being is so that they have plenty of time to read over them, debate them, make changes, and they don't want anything to get rushed through. But the governor can break this rule by declaring a certain issue or bill an emergency. And so these may not be true emergencies, and this can be one way the governor can exert some influence by declaring something an emergency. An example, in 2011, Rick Perry was running for governor, and he declared emergencies on two items, requiring ultrasounds prior to abortions and requiring an ID to vote. And a lot of people believe that he did this because, he's running for the Republican nomination, and so he wanted to show how conservative, how influential he is by making sure these things got passed in the state of Texas. So it was more motivated by his political aspirations than necessarily, what was happening in the state at that time. The governor can call a special session. At the end of the 140-day legislative session, the governor can call special sessions for up to 30 days at a time, and the governor gets to set the agenda of these sessions. Now, this can backfire on the governor as well. So the governor gets to set the agenda. So if he wants a particular topic, debated and a bill passed on that topic, this is a good way to do that. But again, the legislature is under no obligation to do what the governor wants. So if he calls a special session for 30 days and nothing happens, then the governor gets blamed because the legislature has to be paid for that extra time. And so, Texas, we like small government. We don't like government waste. And so it can make the governor take the blame for wasting the money, and it can also make the governor look weak because the Congress essentially just ignored what they wanted. And then, of course, the governor has the veto power. The veto allows him to reject bills that are put on his desk that have been approved by the Congress. There's a couple of different options here. The governor could use the line item veto. So let's say he gets a bill and he likes the overall intention of the bill, but he doesn't like certain provisions. He can veto individual lines of a bill, send it back to the Congress and say, if you take this out, I'll sign the bill into law. Or if the governor doesn't like the whole thing, they veto the entire bill. The legislature can override a veto with a two-thirds vote, but that doesn't happen too often. Um, the governors, on average, will veto about 30 bills per legislative session. When Rick Perry came into office in 2001 as the official governor, he vetoed 82 bills in one day, and this was known as the Father's Day Massacre, June 17th. Uh, he vetoed bills from both parties, Republicans and Democrats, and this was meant to send a message to Congress. George W. Bush was a very charismatic and well-liked guy, and he had a very good working relationship with the legislature and was generally an agreeable person. And Rick Perry wanted to set a different tone. And so the message he was sending to the Congress was, it's a new day. I'm a new governor. I'm the one in charge here. I'm not George W. Bush, and so this is how things are going to be. So it was meant to send a very strong message that he was going to be a very different type of governor than George W. Bush. Military powers, this is kind of relevant right now because of what we're going through. The governor is the commander in chief of the Texas National Guard and can call up the National Guard unless they are being utilized by the federal government. Right now, I have heard that some of our Texas National Guard, you know, servicemen are being called up because of the quarantine. There may be the possibility, you know, if the coronavirus gets worse or people start ignoring, you know, these orders, the social distancing orders, the shelter-in-place orders, that the Texas National Guard can be used to enforce those rules. If, say, the governor puts a curfew in place or something like that, they would be used to enforce that as well. And so they would take their direction from the governor as far as what their role would be. So this is something that if the situation that we're going through right now was to get worse, more people get sick, it's very possible that the Texas National Guard will be mobilized and used in that way. The governor appoints an adjutant general who will oversee the command of the Texas National Guard. And this is typically only used in times of crisis and natural disasters. And so, right now, this is kind of an unprecedented thing. None of us have seen this in our lifetime. So, we don't quite know how this is going to go. But this would be one of those moments where we could see the governor mobilize the Texas National Guard in a major way to assist with this situation in the state. The last time they were really mobilized in a big way was in 2014. Governor Perry mobilized the Guard to help on the border. He believed that ICE and the federal government and Border Patrol were not doing enough to stop illegal immigration on the border, and so he sent the Texas National Guard to try and help out with this situation. The ironic thing is that during their time down on the border, illegal immigration actually went up. It increased, and so they weren't very effective at what he intended them to do. When it comes to judicial powers, the governor does have the power to grant clemency, which is a reduction of someone's criminal punishment, or a pardon, which is a forgiveness of a crime and punishment. He can do so for pretty much anything except for treason or impeachment. In murder cases, capital murder cases where someone is facing the death penalty, the governor can stay in execution for up to 30 days. And this is, say, someone is waiting on an appeal. a determination from the court as to whether, maybe they have new evidence in their case, or there was something that happened in their trial that was unconstitutional. The governor has the power to delay or completely pardon people from execution depending on the circumstances of their trial and their case. These decisions do have to be approved by the Texas Board of Pardons and Parole. So the governor cannot just make these determinations on their own, and this is because of abuse in the system. And this goes back again to James and Miriam Ferguson. While James Ferguson was governor, he issued 2,253 pardons in a 2-year term. That is an insane amount of pardons. And most of these were to his buddies in the financial industry, who were just breaking the law, helping him break the law, embezzle money, that kind of stuff. And then his wife, a few years later, grants 1,161 pardons in a 2-year term. So, because of those two, the governor's power now has to be reviewed by the Texas Board of Pardons and Parole. Informal powers. Now, the governor has a lot of things they can do outside of their formal, powers granted by the Constitution, that help ensure their success and their popularity. And a lot of these have to do with how they work with people. One is just being available. Really good governors. If we look at someone like George W. Bush, Rick Perry and Richards, they were very charismatic people. They went out into the public a lot, met with people, listened to people, and made them feel like they were truly heard. They had a really good ability to do that. And so the more charismatic a governor is in that way, the more successful they tend to be. Our current governor here, this picture is Greg Abbott. He's not quite that good at this. People consider him kind of, he's a little kind of wooden and robotic, and, he's not as charismatic and just generally accessible individual as some of our past governors have been. Endorsements. If a governor is popular, them endorsing other people who are running for office can go a long way to that person being successful in their election. Working the floor. This is the type of relationship that the governor has with the legislature. George W. Bush was very good at this. He would go to the legislature periodically, just kind of walk around the House and the Senate, greet people, talk to people, talk about, the agenda in the legislature, and people really liked him. He was a very charismatic individual, and so that made the legislature more likely to listen to him and kind of take up his agenda. And so, again, this is something that Greg Abbott has not been that great at. He doesn't have as good a working relationship with the legislature as governors have in the past. Going public is just the governor taking their case to the public, trying to sell ideas to the public so that they will then pressure the Congress or elect people who agree with that particular agenda. And then, of course, the media. What we've seen right now, we haven't seen this as much in the past, but the governor, if the governor wants to get on TV to talk to the public, our Texas media outlets are going to cover that. And especially during this time with, the quarantine and the coronavirus, we've been seeing a lot of Governor Abbott, probably more than we have seen him at any time during his time as governor. But because this is such a emergency situation, anytime he wants to get on TV, it's gonna be covered. And so that is something that the governor can do that other politicians in Texas just don't have the ability to do quite as easily. Agenda setting, we've talked about. The governor is going to come into office with an agenda, but again, cannot force the Congress to take that agenda up. The budget. We talked about how the Congress has to pass a budget every legislative session. The governor will also submit a version of the budget, but it is usually ignored in favor of what the Congress comes up with. So, depending on the type of relationship the governor has with the Congress, this will vary from governor to governor. But then once a budget is put in place, the governor is charged with executing that budget when the Congress is not in session. So, because the Congress is only in session for 140 days every other year, the governor has a lot of ability to make changes to that budget when the Congress is not in session. A good example of this, Rick Perry took funds from the budget and allocated it to a program called Operation Strong Safety. So he moved funds around. And what this program did was buy more kind of military type equipment for our law enforcement agencies. It's been kind of criticized, by different sides, but this was not an original intention of the budget when the legislature passed it. But because they were not there and in session to oppose it, Rick Perry had the ability to kind of shift these funds around and use them for different purposes. Some other informal powers and formal powers of the governor. This is Ann Richards here, a really cool lady. She's very charismatic, sassy lady. I definitely highly recommend checking her out or looking her up, watching some of her addresses. She's a very cool lady. State of the State address. Just like the president does a State of the Union address, the governor will do a State of the State address just to tell us how the state is doing, what's going on, what their priorities are. It doesn't get near as much attention as the State of the Union. And most people don't watch this, and it's not a super powerful thing. Like I said, right now, what the governor has been doing because of the quarantine is probably the most we've ever seen the governor on TV in a very long time. So people tend not to pay as much attention to this as they do at the federal level. The governor is also seen as the head of their party for the state. So, because the governor is Republican, he is viewed as the top Republican in the state of Texas. Chief legislator sets an agenda for the party, and then, of course, has a lot of ceremonial duties. One thing that George W. Bush and Richards, these people were really good at was they were always going out into the community to say, um, you know, open parks or go to parades and things like that. And people like that. They like feeling that connection with their governor, feeling that they care about the people and things like that. So a really good governor takes that part of their job very seriously as well. Economic cheerleader, the governor is probably the most important advocate for our state, whether it is our industry, our businesses, the products we produce. They spend a lot of time traveling to other states and to other countries, selling the state of Texas, and selling our economy to other people. And then, of course, crisis manager, that's what we're seeing right now. The governor is looked to as the leader during times of crisis. And, Governor Abbott is being criticized for this right now, saying that he is not being strong enough in the steps that he is taking because of the coronavirus. He's kind of deferring the responsibility to the cities and counties to make decisions for themselves. And the biggest criticism there then is that we have some counties and cities that are doing, doing full lockdowns. We have some that aren't doing any, like out in West Texas. Fort Worth took longer to do it than Dallas, and people feel like the governor should have taken on the responsibility of declaring this for the entire state. But there's a lot of reasons why he might not want that responsibility. He could be blamed for it if people feel like he's overreacting. He's also, a big Trump supporter, and so he wants to, keep the president happy and things like that. So a lot of people have criticized Greg Abbott for not being the leader that we need during this time. So that'll be something to watch if this situation was to get worse. Is he going to step up and be that leader that we need during this emergency? I love this picture of Rick Perry. I will always use this picture of Rick Perry. It's hilarious to me. Texas has our governor is considered very weak compared to other governors around the state. And a lot of this is due to, when we wrote that final constitution, we had a governor before, E.J. Davis, that was kind of abusing that power. So we took a lot of those powers away from the governor. And then, of course, we get the Fergusons, who lead to even more power being taken away from the governor. And, here in Texas, we don't like big government. and we don't like the idea of giving one person too much power. And so that's why we have one of the weakest governors in the entire country. Um, the governor is a full time position, the legislature is part time. And so the governor does have an advantage in that his term gives him some advantages of making decisions and using power when the legislature is not in session. We talked about the appointees. We talked about the governor. The longer they're in office, the more people they're able to appoint that are loyal to their agenda. And then party power. The power of the governor's party in the state will also bolster their own power. So if Republicans are control the legislature and are very popular in the state, and the governor is also Republican, that gives them a lot of authority. Um, George W. Bush is kind of credited for bringing Republicans kind of back into party. Rick Perry's term in office solidified that because he was governor for so long. But now that we're starting to see Texas shift politically, it'll be interesting to see how this moves forward. If Abbott, if our governor will stay Republican, or will open up other opportunities in the state for Democrats or challengers and things like that, because Republicans are losing some of their influence. That's it for the governor. So go over this chapter once you're done with your midterms and all that. And then we'll have another chapter next week before we have our conference session. So if you have any questions over this, we can talk about it then, or before then, you can always email me questions as well.